Caddis Maximus here, just with a video. It's an overall discussion, kind of comparison, and a little bit of a review of reciprocating saw blades. And yes, that is like a 15-year collection. Oh, I'm a little muffled here. Remember about face masks, the wire actually goes up around your nose, and then you press it around your nose. My nose isn't quite that pointy. But you press it around the face, around your nose, so it provides a better seal. The wire doesn't go on your chin, it goes around your nose. Don't forget to hit like and even check out some of the t-shirts I have on my little merch sale for my link at Teespring/Caddis Maximus. Unfortunately, there's been some economic turmoil, and that has affected me as well, so that's why I mentioned that. We'll start off with like basics about Sawzall Blades, and we'll get into more detailed kind of tool aficionado stuff at the end, comparing what Milwaukee's been doing to a little bit cheapify their blades, and how they've been phasing out some really old, good, and handy ones. We'll start off with the one thing you should know about reciprocating saw blades is they all have the same connection, half-inch tang. Milwaukee invented this retention method, and worldwide it's the very same thing that's used today. The only thing that changes is depending on the type of blades. We can see that the tang is not actually straight in line. The blade's actually pointed downwards a little bit, so that way when it cuts it goes forward and it kind of hammers in and really drives in the teeth. And there's some issues with that. It is aggressive, but it can actually cause the blade to dull a little sooner. If you ever get a package that has a blade like this, it looks slightly bent that way, but if we look at it on this side, we can see that it's significantly bent and twisted. You can expect pretty darn good quality control about reciprocating saw blades. In my like 15 years of collecting plus, probably like 18 years, although I've really cut back in the last few years, very rare to find any kind of defect, whether it's a misprint or a warped one where this somehow came off its track and got like caught in some rollers. They're always pretty good. This is the first Milwaukee blades. Both of these were next to each other in a pack, but this is one here. Come on now. Where you can see the printing was somehow got really badly offset. And the very next blade, it was a 5-pack, and there were just these two blades. The next blade had no printing at all. Super rare. Never seen a Sawzall blade. They are exactly the same blade. No printing. So pretty darn rare. And even with Lennox, this is one where it somehow got offset, but still did okay. Also, I recommend avoiding really cheap blades. Say here's a really cheap like Chinese carbide grit blade where they just didn't even get the grit. This isn't grit that's been knocked off. It just wasn't even applied properly in the first place, and you're just wasting your money in a lot of situations buying super cheap blades. Their materials are super weak, like the Harbor Freight Warrior versus their more premium Bauer and Hercules lines. Speaking of grit blades, I don't have a ton of them. I do have a few different generations. You always know you have a Milwaukee blade from like the 80s and 90s when they say Super Sawzall. These are arguably like when they were really nice and really consistent. When Milwaukee came out with the linear or the inline type reciprocating saw, the before then, they were like hedge trimmers. They were terrible. That's why they were so dominant, and really coming out with reciprocating saw blades just made a huge difference. Unfortunately, Milwaukee's gone downhill where, like with the Bosches, what Bosch currently still does is make some nice, easy to read instructions. When you grab a blade, you know it's for cast iron and block. The old Milwaukee's used to be that way. We can't compare. I think the Bosch blades are also pretty competitive. They're just not very common in stores, and they hardly ever seem to go on sale. But between a Milwaukee and a Bosch, maybe the Bosch grit just a little bit thicker. I know the Bosch blades really are pretty good, but the Milwaukees have been an institution. They probably sell more reciprocating saw blades than everybody else combined. The other thing is the Harbor Freights. Here's one of their diamond grit blades, which is pretty cheap. You would use this in the same situations as carbide grit. The diamond grit for a little bit more money should last a bit longer, although it is a bit slower cutting. So the carbide grit would be great for, cast iron pipes and, cinder blocks, but the diamond grit would be really for wrought cast iron, just because there's so much carbon, you get little carbides that build up. But if we were to, say, compare to a Milwaukee blade here, this is the only other diamond grit blade, you can use these blades to actually cut glass and all sorts of stuff. It's very handy. we can see that the Harbor Freight really just has not put on very much grit at all, and they kind of wrap it around. Where we're on the Milwaukee, a higher quality blade, we can see that they've actually put quite a bit of effort actually trying to pile it up right on the edge of the blade. So trying, instead of putting a bunch on the sides where you don't need it, there's a whole bunch of real thick cutting surface where it's just a thin coating. So like these Harbor Freight ones end up being a diminishing return versus just buying one actual nice one. And of course, Milwaukee's new printing is really deep red, and they have like this little glitter thing in there, and that seems to be kind of like their deal these days, is putting glitter in their logo, and I'm not exactly sure why. You can just see it there, but I think it's a little weird. I should also mention that these types of blades, if we look at the angle of the tang versus the body of the blade, they have a much less steep of a rake angle because of the grit. Biting down hard just risks actually damaging the grit, so they're just designed to slide back and forth more like a normal blade. Moving on to more specialty blades, Milwaukee's come out with a super thin sheet metal blade that just doesn't tear up the metal as much. It's a 32 tooth per inch ductwork blade. It's actually really short, sharp, and stubby. It is the stubbiest blade I've ever seen. It doesn't even have teeth on the front, I think, just to help slide it in, but the idea is you put this in the Recipsaw and you would jam it through a piece of ductwork that you're maybe adding a junction to or a vent or something, and or any kind of, that galvanized sheet metal. You jam it through, and then you can just start doing your cut blind. And so they have these little packs of ductwork blades. Other blades that it's sad to see that you pretty much have to order because they don't want to carry them on shelves is these really stubby 4-inch blades, say this 24 tooth Milwaukee or these 18 tooth Lennox blades. I think Milwaukee blades are still better than Lennox blades, and Lennox tends to be just a bit overpriced, at least in my experience sometimes. And nonetheless, sometimes if you are working with sheet or pretty thin products, it's nice to actually have these short blades because then it's easier to prevent yourself from, say, over penetrating. And of course, one little comparison is like on the Milwaukees, there's just a little bit of rounding on the tip of the blade where it's super sharp on the Lennox. Of course, Milwaukee came out with these blades, which are the only kind of reciprocating saw blade you'll ever find that has a built-in handle. It has this odd design where it actually has some blank teeth there and there. It's called a flush cut blade, and it's really designed for remodel contractors, surprisingly enough. Somebody's remodeling a house, they want to add a door where there's currently a wall. On a wall that you're going to have a piece of wood at the bottom, which is the bottom plate, some vertical pieces of wood, which are the studs, and then 2 pieces of wood at the top, which is known as the top plate. So you'd make your cut around, and what ends up happening with traditional reciprocating saw, you usually use that because you're right next to one of the studs trying to cut in the space for the door, is you just do it at an angle. Unfortunately, oftentimes you end up cutting into the plywood pretty badly when you're trying to do that. The idea behind this blade is it has a completely straight shank, so it has no hook at all. It just goes straight back and forth. You turn off orbiting if you have orbiting on your saw, and it has 2 inches of clearance, so you'd be able just to go through the top plate, and then when it hits the bottom of the plywood, these blanks here prevent it from, the idea is to prevent it from over penetrating, so you can cut that bottom plate easy and flush. And it's kind of an expensive blade, but you won't be using it except for those certain types of situations where you really need to get like flush against the surface. You also get a ton of vibration because this blade obviously weighs a huge amount. It's just a giant piece of steel, unbelievable blade. Other specialty blades we're talking about grit, there are of course the carbide tooth blades. We have a Diablo 3 tooth per inch pruning blade. I really like this as a pruning blade. Really great if you're working on any kind of hardwoods or dried woods. I think it's probably one of the best pruning blades. If you're working on green or softwoods, I would definitely recommend a more traditional double cut because they're way faster, even though these kind of bodies do bend a bit easy. And since they are just hardened steel, they don't last quite as long as the carbide teeth. But this is a traditional, say, bow saw, what you would find on a bow saw. And you can see that the way the teeth are ground, this cuts in both directions, going forwards and backwards. These are really fast. They're undeniably fast. So yeah, you get the more expensive carbide when you really think that you would prefer longevity over just raw speed. So of course there's many traditional Sawzall blades, but now they're coming out with these heavy duty demolition ones like this Milwaukee here with carbide teeth. So it's just like their normal high speed steel tooth blades, but they just put on little pieces of carbide just like that. And I have one other, which is the Diablo, which also make really good blades, and they're probably the, if you can't find the Milwaukee and you can find the Diablo, I would say go for it, because the Diablos are really absolutely excellent blades. And they kind of fit that in between portion. You say the Milwaukee is a 5 tooth per inch, or on the Freud it's 6 tooth per inch, so it's just a little bit finer there. Which you get I've done a video about these Milwaukee axe carbides, and they are pretty aggressive, but the teeth are 5 teeth per inch is 200,000ths of an inch between teeth. It's pretty far, it's like pretty thick pitch. And so the idea of the carbide is, once again, they last longer, but if you're going to run into a bunch of nails or you're having to cut through conduit and other various stuff in a wall, really I think the slightly finer 6 tooth on the Diablos would be your ultimate bet. And all the major manufacturers have like carbide tooth, and they even have pure metal cutting ones, but I don't have any of those, which are just the metal cutting fine tooth but with a strip of carbide. They are pretty expensive. And just for funsies, what we have here is probably the most aggressive as far as tooth-wise reciprocating saw blade you'll ever see. And this is a variable pitch, and we'll get into that on some other blades. But this is a traditional, I'd say blended, where it's a few teeth that are 3 teeth per inch, and then it transitioned to a section where it's 2 teeth per inch. That's 12.7 millimeters or ½ inch. So the difference between this tooth, and this tooth would be an inch. And I mean, these teeth are big enough to, almost get your entire finger or half your finger into. So this will be a 2 to 3 DPI variable pitch pruning blade, and it is just the most aggressive pattern you'll ever see. I think this is like a cheap master mechanic or something. So that's about pruning blades, and kind of about carbide tip blades and some of the more odd ones, such as the really short ones of these flush clip blades. Here we are in a section just discussing variable teeth, and I forgot to mention that yes, Milwaukee makes even these rough-in blades, which are kind of like jigsaw style tight turning radius roughing blades if you need to put in a vent, or remodeling an upstairs and are installing a bathroom. That's one of the options, is they do have these kind of high articulation rough-in blades. Talking about variable pitch, there's actually 3 different styles, and different styles work a little better. This Diablo is an old style. Freud doesn't use this style. They just use a 6 TPI, so these are outdated because it turns out it just doesn't work quite as well. But just like on the previous blades, and these are a Swedish Sandflex Baco, so this is a Snap-on company, unbelievably. This is a 10 to 14, so we have a kind of a higher coarse, faster material removing 10 TPI section, then it slowly progresses to a 14 TPI. These are really good for general demolition. If you're an automobile dismantler, these are great because they work through the sheet metal, but still the deeper sections provide good material removal. And just like on that pruning blade. So then there's, I believe, is offset or phase, such as what Milwaukee's done on their new record blades, besides making them thinner, but we'll get into that later, is where they have essentially big wide teeth that are spaced at 7 teeth per inch, 7 TPI. And then they have extra undercuts, which would be 11 TPI. And so they're phased. It's kind of a 11 TPI blade laid over, matched over the top of a 7 TPI blade. And then the least common style, which even Freud has abandoned, is this linear style where it starts out at 7 TPI, then has a 6 TPI section, and finally near the tip it ends up at 5 TPI. And the problem with that is different sections of the blade act like entirely different blades. So if you have nails way out here, it's just grabbing onto them much harder than if it is back here. And so that's why even Freud abandoned that style of variable pitch, and now you pretty much have these 2 styles. And this style is what Freud uses on their kind of multi-material blades. Here's a real quick jump cut that'll be easy for people to miss. Just wanted to compare the 8 to 10 TPI versus Milwaukee's 7 to 11 TPI. Kind of a different combination of tooth pitches there, and you can see them how the Milwaukee almost looks a little bit more aggressive than the Freud. What Freud also opts to do is have a shorter blade, but it's thicker, and that would be compared. Milwaukee kind of wrecked the Wrecker, but the Diablo's pretty good, just not quite as tall, and like I said, just a little bit thicker. The old Wreckers, which were a straight 6 TPI, which I think was what they were best at, were actually much thicker, and Milwaukee made them thinner, and they cost the same. There's a huge variety of blades. That was kind of the point of the photo, but I just couldn't do a review with them. And they're kind of spread out with different labels. But these are several different blades that are all essentially designed for the same purpose. Just so you can have a different look. Another blade I should mention, which whenever the blade says clean, that means they have this clean grind. So it's kind of like the pruning blade, where it has a really sharp 2-bevel cut. But this one's only designed to cut on the backstroke, and the whole purpose of a blade like this is to provide a cleaner, sharper cut. And so, but they do dull more quickly, and so if you're just doing demolition, you may notice these really tall teeth, but in reality, it's for making cleaner cuts rather than quicker, heavier duty cuts. Well, it'll do that, it'll just be a diminishing amount of return. Otherwise, the big point, at least for a long time, was that most of these types of blades, if we align the DeWalt like that, we'll do it like this. And 2 of the Milwaukees. Unfortunately, Milwaukee has kind of changed their blades up. What used to be a 50-35. This camera really hates this situation. Both of these are 50. So what used to be a 6 TPI blade is now transformed into a 5 TPI blade, which is always a little disappointing. Especially because you kind of get used to the way you like a blade to perform. And I'll do a little comparison there. We can see that on the 5 TPI Milwaukee, it just looks like there's not as much space in the root of the teeth for wood to get into. So even though the teeth themselves are like really blocky and heavy duty, they actually cut more slowly, and they're cut a little bit more roughly. And I think the 6 TPI was best. And all of these blades, the coating on the Lennox isn't great, so it's kind of clogging it up. All pretty much have the very same tip shape. Milwaukee always had just a little bit more of an undercut than, say, the DeWalt or the Lennox, or even the Irwins. The Irwins are absolutely terrible blades. I do not recommend them. Really was pretty well optimized, and like a Starrett cuts really fast, but the teeth are really pretty thin. And most people don't know that Starrett, that's like been one of their things for a long time, is manufacturing blades. Besides, they're really known for their precision measuring instruments, but it's blades have been one of their bread and butter items for a real long time. It's just surprising for how good their measuring instruments are. Their blades are okay, but they're not great. Surprisingly enough, most blades, reciprocating saw blades, are made in the U.S. Most of those Freud Diablos I showed you are made in the U.S. All the Milwaukees are real proud that they're still made in the U.S. Just because it's a highly automated process, so there isn't a lot of labor involved, because it's just all machines that make these blades. Anyway, I'll finish this up with metal cutting blades. And of course, we're finishing out with metal cutting blades. Some really advertise all these have cobalt content, like these Master Mechanic Extreme Demolition, which were indeed pretty cheap. 14 TPI, it's just a really long metal cutting blade. Definitely a cheaper tooth design on that. So it's a lot simpler. Besides the ones that have the carbide teeth, but they're very expensive, and you have to be a little bit more careful when it comes to the carbide tooth metal cutting blades, because they can work very good in some situations. But if they're banging against anything, that they're really susceptible, because it isn't individual little welded pieces. It's just one strip of carbide, I think, friction welded onto the steel body, and they can get broken up. And so for their price, I'd say stick really with normal ones, because you can always find them on sale. The Irwin Weld Techs are a little better for their metal cutting blades. They are pretty thick. Most of these are pretty similar. The DeWalt and Diablo are doing, and as well as even the Milwaukee Wreckers are doing this thing where they're doing these interleaved variable pitch, so pretty standard. What's nice is that DeWalt still selling these really thin blades, which I'll show an example, but these are actually really nice in so many situations where you may need to get against the surface, because you can flex the blade and it will still cut, and you can get right next to something. DeWalt's recently even updated their blades but they had these 2X ones, and I couldn't figure it out, but it was because they had 8% cobalt in the teeth instead of 5%, and they're saying 2X to life. I did appreciate that these were also variable pitch metal cutting, which is kind of rare to find. 1418 TPI is a pretty good compromise. It's kind of hard to see that variation, but it's the same interleaved where you have like deeper cuts and then you have a couple teeth that are ground really close together. But I think overall these DeWalt's are a nice alternative. The Lennox just seemed like, you know, good old blades, and then of course more basic is just teeth per inch. So we have a 10, and if for some reason my camera doesn't like to focus anymore, 14 next courses, and we have our 18, and then you have 24 teeth, and I'm just doing this. The Milwaukee double duty upgrade I think is a similar thing where they went from 5 to 8% cobalt, but it really didn't seem to make much of a difference. Obviously, the coarser the teeth, the thicker the metal, because if you're using really thin sheet metal like ductwork with the 10-tooth blade, the wall of the ductwork will just get in between. It will just fall right into the root of the blade, and it'll just make these big tear. It'll wear out the blade really fast, and it'll just make a terrible cut. So that's why you want these different pitches of blades, is you have to have an idea of what you're cutting. Now, some situations say maybe you're dismantling a motorhome, and so you have sheet metal over insulation and even wood, a variety of materials. That's really where variable pitch blades can come in handy versus having to choose a fine pitch or a coarse pitch and maybe risk wearing out the coarse pitch too easy. One thing I will complain about is Milwaukee's been really pushing these thin curved blades as their small thin blades, and they work out okay, but for a long time I think they still sell these, like these 5193s. God, my camera is not cooperating. And I really like these blades. They were small, lightweight. They had a really short, they're really narrow, so they just didn't have a lot of friction. They have this Milwaukee trademark. It's actually kind of hard to see. But one of the big deals about Milwaukee blades is you can just see that pattern, that crosshatch pattern. That's intentional. The rollers that they manufacture these with have that pattern on them. And what that does is that provides these little ridges when you're cutting metal, and it reduces heat, it reduces friction, makes it easier for the blade to go back and forth, and it really does make a difference. And most manufacturers, Lennox, DeWalt, nobody really does that, and that was something that set Milwaukee apart, is having that friction reducing surface. And they've actually kept that, but on their torch, that's what these hexagons are, is you can just see the indentations of this. Maybe on the back side of this one. Yeah, there you go. You can see the hexagon. So they just kind of modified that pattern, but it does make a difference. Otherwise, I was saying, you know, you can use variable pitch when you're going through various materials. It's really where the variable pitch is an advantage and really shines, is where you have to go through a layer like a metal clad door. You have to remove wood and metal. Really gets it done. But it's just a shame that these small, cheaper blades have less markup. So Milwaukee's really been pushing their heavier duty blades. In many situations, these long, thin, narrow blades are exactly what you want. They just don't get stuck. They cut real nice. And you're not spending unnecessary money because you're not worried so much about maybe bending the blade as you are just wearing out the teeth. So anyway, sorry for such a long video about reciprocating saw blades. It's kind of hard to really organize them in the kind of subjects and things that I did want to talk about and show and compare in a real short video. But I super appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing, and anybody who is, which is apparently a lot of people at the time I'm making this video who may be stuck at home. And I really appreciate you spending a little time with me, and I hope that, and I know it's not possible for everyone, but I hope that as many people as absolutely possible are safe and healthy. And to a very speedy recovery to anybody who may not be at full health. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.